Good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for watching this webinar on the European Trade Agreements, a joint project between CEBRI and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, CAIS. This panel is part of a larger program on the reorientations of multilateralism, and this panel is sponsored by the Multilateralism Program and the Europe Program. It is with great honor that we receive today distinguished guests, Mr. Inácio Garcia Becero from the European Commission, Ricardo Mendes from Perspectiva Consulting, and Abrão Arabi Neto from Anchão. Before passing the floor to the moderators to start this amazing debate, I would like to invite Ariane Costa from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for some introductory remarks. Thank you and have a nice event.
Thank you, Mariana. Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Brazil. I would like to congratulate all the speakers and naturally CEBRI for a great partnership in this initiative. Well, European Union trade agreements is a topic of major importance for us as a German political foundation. CAS works worldwide with strong international relations principles, including fostering the European unity, strengthening transatlantic relations, and protecting multilateralism, which, quoting Laval, is not only an ideological aspiration, but also a pragmatic method for dealing with issues of interdependence between countries. So, the European Union is one of the most important players in the international trade system, not only for its numbers, but also for its values. More multilateralism, not only free trade, but also fair trade, in addition to endorsing international cooperation. In this realm, deepening relations between Europe and Latin America are especially crucial to us. Brazil, for instance, is the world's single largest exporter of agricultural products to Europe. The conclusion of the EU-Mercosur trade agreement, for example, could provide important economic stimuli in a post-pandemic scenario for both sides of the Atlantic, including even high social and sustainability standards. So CAS strongly supports this trade agreement and advocates for an intensive trade partnership between Europe and Brazil. And I know as much as this seminar is intended to debate EU trade policy and strategies in a much broader sense, we would like to highlight and bring attention to those specific topics. But I am looking forward to hear from all of you. So without much further delay, I wish you all an excellent debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ariane. And as I said, this panel is part of a larger project on the future of multilateralism. And therefore, I pass the floor to Lia Walsh, who is CEBRI Senior Fellow, and is going to introduce the topic of the debate and explain a little bit about the project. Thank you and have a nice debate. You're mute, Lia. Please, your mic.
Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank on behalf of Ana Jaguaribe, member of the CEBRI Board of Trustees and coordinator of the research group on multilateralism, and also on my behalf, the presence of our guest panelists and the audience that is with us now or later through the video recorded by CEBRI. The webinar is a part of a research program undertaken by CEBRI with the support of Konrad Adenauer Foundation on multilateralism from different perspectives. Last year, we concentrated on the crisis of multilateralism, some of its reasons and the significance for Brazil. This year, we start from the assumption that there is a renewed call for multilateral questions, which is not simple a return to the negotiation of the past, but brings into play new issues, players, and narratives. Our research program on multilateralism has 4 dimensions: political global realignments, technological innovation and digital economy, Anthropocene crisis, sustainability, global health, and finally, trade and international political economy. Our webinar today addresses the issue of trade and international political economy. Our point of departure is the premise that the difficulties of advancing global multilateralism negotiations failed and regional agreements advanced, particularly in Europe and Asia. Nonetheless, the pandemic brought again on the agenda the importance of cooperation and again the importance of multilateralism. It highlighted again the importance of multilateralism. Nonetheless, at the same time, there is a risk for some and the perception that also there is a bias toward protectionism measures nowadays in different countries. Europe has a crucial role in this agenda, not only as a supporter of multilateral in the sense as Brazil is as well, and a very important contributor to the multilateral trade system, and at the same time, the experience of Europe that has done a lot of different agreements with different partners bring us again a very important issue that is about trade agreements today, that is the regulatory capacity of the Europeans to make this kind of arrangements with different countries and to tackle the problem of different asymmetries. So we are very happy to have this seminar together with the European group of CEBRI, today represented here, but Ana Paula. This is a joint venture between the two. We are, as a multilateral group, we want also to have joint ventures with different groups of CEBRI to exercise our multilateral. Okay, so we are very happy, and I'm sure we are going to have a very good debate today. So I pass the word to Ana. Thank you very much for all of you.
Thank you, Lia. Good morning, good afternoon. It's a pleasure having the opportunity to work with Lia Valls and the multilateralism program in this initiative. My name is Ana Paula Tostes. I'm a senior fellow at CEBRI, more specifically at the Europe program. Dr. Ronaldo Verano is the trustee of the Group of Europe. He could not stay with us this morning. However, his support was crucial for this event, so I would like to thank Ronaldo. Ambassador Marcos Galvão is always ready to collaborate with our program as well. So thank you, Ambassador, for your support. So today we will debate about the EU landscape of the trade relations. And we can say that we have seen the EU modeling regional and bilateral trade and investment relations by several initiatives of free trade agreements. Very recent free trade agreements entered into force in the last 3 or 4 years. The EU-Canada Trade and Investment Agreement, the EU-New Zealand, EU-Australia, EU-Japan, EU-Singapore, EU-Vietnam, EU-China, among others. So how much might these EU's FTAs become an instrument to export European norms and policies, and environment policies, intellectual property rights, standards of laws, production and services, for example? From the EU's point of view, we would ask and reflect about what is the role of the multilateral trade system in the presence of so many European comprehensive agreements. From the Brazilian perspective, we could also debate eventually about what are the effects of non-trade dimension of the EU trade agreements. So what about the Brazilian private sector facing to a new regulatory framework that we have seen the EU promoting in world trade relations? So we have so many questions, so much to debate, and we are very interested in hearing from our guests their views of the perspectives about the future conditions of the international trade economic flows, the future of WTO and multilateralism. So for learning more about this topic, we have our debate today, and it is a great privilege having so honored guests for that. So we have today with us Mr. Ignacio Garcia Bercero. And Mr. Bercero, I would like to thank you very much for accepting the invitation to join us today. It's a pleasure and an honor having you at this seminar. Mr. Ignacio Bercero is currently the director in charge of multilateral affairs, strategy and economic analysis at DG for Trade and European Commission. Mr. Bercero was the chief negotiator for the TTIP negotiations, the director of sustainable development and bilateral trade relations, the chief negotiator for the EU-Korea and EU-India FTAs, and the head of the unity for WTO dispute settlement. Also, we have Abrão Arabi Neto with us. Abrão is the executive vice president at AmCham Brazil. Previously, he served as secretary of foreign trade and director of international negotiations at the Ministry of Development, Industry and Foreign Trade. Thank you, Abrão Neto. We are very, very pleased to have your comments in this debate. Thank you for accepting to participate in our webinar. Also, we have Ricardo Mendes with us. Ricardo is a partner director of Prospective Consultoria. He currently directs the company's international operations and projects, including the offices in Bogotá, Buenos Aires, and Washington, D.C. And thank you, Ricardo, for debating with us today. So for today, Mr. Bercero will talk first about the EU perspective on our topic. After Mr. Bercero, we will have the comments and remarks of our guests, Abrão Neto and Ricardo Mendes. I also would like to remind all that the participants of this webinar are very welcome to submit questions by the Q&A function on Zoom. Leah will moderate comments and questions. So let's start. Let me give now the floor to Mr. Bercero. Thank you.
Yes, hello, and it's a big pleasure to be here. So if I had some trouble connecting, but I hope that you can listen to me well now. Now, what I would like to share with you is some reflections about the European Union trade policy strategy. Earlier this year, in the month of February, the European Commission published a document aiming to give strategic orientations for European Union trade policy over the next few years. And our basic aim in preparing this trade policy strategy is seeing how trade policy could be responsive to the new geopolitical and economic context, which has very fundamentally changed over the last 5 years. We've seen there are 3 basic challenges which we are experiencing in Europe, but which I think are being experienced all over the world, and which of course have profound implications for trade policy. A first challenge has to do with the geopolitical conflict between the United States and China. This is a conflict which escalated during the Trump administration that had profound implications on trade and on trade policy. And all the signals is that this conflict is something which is here to stay, that under potentially different forms is continue to be there during the next few years. And this raises, of course, the challenge about how to ensure that the trading system can show resilience in the context of this geopolitical conflict, taking into account that the rules of the international trade as they currently are, they are not necessarily well equipped to ensure that there is a level playing field to respond to the challenges of competition with state capitalism. So this geopolitical conflict is the first fundamental challenge that is being experienced, and to which we need to see how European Union trade policy needs to adapt and needs to react. The second challenge is more of an economic nature. It is digitalization, which is having a profound impact on the competitive advantages of companies. It is something which is leading to a transformation of industry. It is implying that digital trade is becoming increasingly important, central for international economic relationships. And it also implies that often we are going to be facing a technology security nexus. And this, of course, gives rise to particular challenges for the international trading system, which again currently is not well adapted. It lacks rules on digital trade. It lacks rules to deal with the challenges also in areas connected to trade, like taxation or competition policies. And the third big strategic challenge has to do with the commitment by the European Union, but I think by an increasing number of countries, to ensure that our economies are clearly in the path of achieving climate neutrality. We have taken a commitment in Europe towards ensuring that by 2050, Europe will be a climate neutral continent. But if we want to go in that direction, the changes need to start now. And the next 10 years are going to be of critical importance for the ambition of achieving the climate neutrality. It is something which is going to have a profound implication on all areas of European policy. And of course, trade policy inevitably is also going to be affected by this ambition to move towards climate neutrality. And it is very clear, for instance, that any trade policy initiative by the European Union would need to be justified in terms of being supportive of the objective of climate neutrality. So those, I think, are the three big strategic challenges that we are facing in Europe, but not only in Europe. I'm sure that if you were actually discussing this issue in Brazil, you would probably agree that these are the challenges that we are facing. I think probably you have a debate about trade policy in the United States. Again, you will very much see that these are the fundamental challenges which are being faced by the global trading system. Now, how do we see that European Union trade policy should position itself in this new geopolitical and economic context? The trade policy strategy that we have published talks about a trade policy which is open, sustainable, and assertive. And I think that the three adjectives clearly have a meaning. Openness, because the European Union has a fundamental economic and political interest to maintain an open trade policy. We are highly dependent of international trade, not only on exports, but also imports. Imports are critical for the competitivity of the European economy. We are highly reliant on a rule-based trading system. European Union trade policy has always evolved on the basis of WTO rules. And for us, therefore, it is fundamental to continue to have the cornerstone, which is provided by a rule-based trading system. And we are therefore particularly concerned about the weakening of multilateral institutions on trade. So openness is fundamental. It is something that we very much want to ensure that despite the new geopolitical conflicts, the European Union can be a force in support of open and rule-based trade. Secondly, sustainable. I mean, I already indicated before that climate neutrality is central for everything that the European Union is going to be doing on trade and on other policies. So we need to be able to integrate sustainability into all the aspects of European Union policies, including the trade policy. And this has a profound implication for what we are doing bilaterally, for what we are doing in the multilateral agenda, and also for actions that we will be adopting autonomously, like, for instance, new legislation on the introduction of a carbon border adjustment measure, new legislation on deforestation. These are all important initiatives that the European Union is going to develop over the next year or so. And where, of course, we know that there are going to be importance of establishing also a dialogue and cooperation with other countries. The fact that we are acting autonomously on a number of areas doesn't mean that we are not actually wanting to act in cooperation and dialogue with other trading partners. Which brings me precisely to the third element. When we say that the European Union policy should be assertive, it means that we should not hesitate in acting in order to defend our rights, but that we should not hesitate in taking, when necessary, autonomous action, but we would always aim to do it in a manner which is supportive of the multilateral system and which is consistent with our international obligations. Now, how does all of these principles, if you want, translate into the practice, into how European Union trade policy is going to be evolving over the next few years? One first important message which comes from our new trade policy strategy, and on which I would like to particularly develop what is left of my intervention, is the priority that we want to give to the reform of the WTO. This is fundamental in view of our commitment to multilateralism, and I would want to focus particularly my intervention on this. But of course, the priority in terms of the multilateral trade policy agenda doesn't mean that we are actually forgetting other aspects of our trade policy. The European Union has had over the last 10 years a very active policy of negotiating bilateral free trade agreements. We have developed a very broad network of bilateral free trade agreements, and we will continue to give a lot of importance of completing this network. Of course, this implies ratification of agreements that we have already concluded, and a few agreements have more economic and political significance than the agreement that we concluded with Mercosur. I mean, of course, this is an agreement which is still in the phase of preparing the finalization of the text. So there is work being developed between the two teams to fix a few open issues and to do the legal scrubbing of the text. Eventually, it would have to be translated into all European languages, but I would not wish to hide that there are also political challenges. Political challenges for the ratification of this agreement in Europe, which are fundamentally due to concerns about policies relating to deforestation and relating to climate change. I mean, as I said before, these issues are now central for European Union trade policy. Our agreement with Mercosur includes specific commitments relating to the Paris Agreement. And I think it's going to be critical for ratification that before an effort is made, that we reach a good common understanding about how to ensure that these commitments are effectively implemented. And as I said, there are at this point in time still serious concerns relating to issues linked to deforestation and the fight against climate change. So, I mean, concluding the bilateral trade negotiations will continue to be an important focus of European Union trade policy. And apart from the case of Mercosur that I mentioned, we are also negotiating other bilateral trade agreements. We are negotiating with Australia. We are negotiating with New Zealand. We are negotiating to modernize our trade agreement with Chile. And very recently, it was decided that we would resume negotiations of a trade agreement with India. So we still have, I would say, an active bilateral trade agenda, even if I've indicated the top priority for us over the next few years is going to be multilateral, and it's going to be linked to the agenda for WTO reform. And the third element of our trade policy, before I go to the multilateral agenda, has to do with developing the toolbox of different instruments that we need to have in order to be able to defend our interests. We are advancing in the introduction of legislation to ensure the reciprocity on public procurement. We have presented recently a proposal to enhance our capacity to respond against subsidies that have a distortive impact in the European market. And we are looking into other possible legislative initiatives that we will be developing over the next year. So this is, if you want, the overall picture about European Union trade policy guided by these three basic principles. But what I would like to say is a few more words about multilateralism and what is the European Union agenda for the reform of the World Trade Organization. I mean, as I indicated before, we think that a rule-based trade system is in the fundamental interest of the European Union. And that's why we would really wanted to work together with other countries, including Brazil, obviously, to see how we can concentrate our efforts to reform the WTO, because it seems clear to us that the status quo is sustainable. I mean, the current situation that we have is a World Trade Organization that has failed to produce any significant new trade agreement for more than a decade, despite the fact that the international rule book is clearly outdated. It needs to be modernized. We are having the World Trade Organization that no longer has a functioning dispute settlement system. And this is very risky because we are going to see inevitably an increase of trade tensions. Not having an agreed arbitration procedure to channel those tensions is going to be very, very disruptive. And it's something that will be that reforming and restoring WTO dispute settlement is of critical. We have very significant divisions of views among WTO members about the direction in which the organization should go. Now, despite this, I think that there are reasons to be, I would say, moderately optimistic, because we have a number of circumstances over the next few years that are more propitious than they have been in order to see how to move forward with an agenda for WTO reform. We have just selected a new Director General in the WTO, who has made clear that she's strongly committed towards reform, who clearly has a very active reform-led agenda. We have a significant that have made very clear that the WTO needs to be fundamentally reformed, that there are important changes that need to be introduced into the way that the WTO functions. And I have to say, very like-minded with Brazil on many of the issues which are important for the WTO reform agenda. And we have a new US administration that has signaled a commitment towards multilateralism, and which clearly is taking a different attitude onto the role of international institutions than the previous US administration. I have to say that still we do not know yet exactly how this will be translated in practice, what it is, the type of engagement that we can expect from the Biden administration on trade. In all fairness, it's only a few months since the administration is in place. They still have not yet appointed, for instance, an ambassador to the WTO in Geneva. So I think one needs to understand that some time may be needed before the new administration develops a policy on the WTO. But we hope that it's going to be a policy which is more constructive, which implies more willingness to engage with others, in particularly with like-minded, and that would create a dynamic that would make it possible to put forward a WTO reform agenda. I mean, that's certainly very much the direction in which we wish to go. We are very intensively discussing these issues with other countries. We are members of the Ottawa group of like-minded countries, in which Brazil also participate, and we have been cooperating on a number of issues in the lead up to NC12, including on issues relating to trade and health, which is one of the important immediate challenges for the global trading system. But Fundamentally, what it is that we think should be the direction in which we need to reform the WTO. 3 fundamental issues. The first one is that there's a need to modernize the international rule book. The fundamental value of the WTO is that it provides rules that ensure stability for business, that ensure predictability of international trade relations. That has been the fundamental value that the WTO has been providing since its creation in 1995. But at this point in time, on some critical issues for international trade, either there are no rules or the rules are clearly outdated. Now, a clear example of an area where there are no rules is digital trade. I mean, as I indicated before, increasingly, so many trade activities are linked to digital trade that not having commonly agreed rules on this issue is clearly very much undermining the credibility of the WTO as an international organization for trade. The good news is that for more than 1 year, there have been negotiations in the WTO on e-commerce, and that more than 100 countries are participating in these negotiations, including, by the way, Brazil, including China, including the United States. Of course, many, many challenges linked to these negotiations, and we still are not there in terms of saying that we can see the conclusion of these negotiations. But it is clear that one of the critical issues is going to be, can we conclude in the WTO a credible agreement on e-commerce, which is inevitably going to be a plurilateral agreement. I think it is simply not feasible to imagine that this type of things can be agreed by all the members of the WTO. If we stick only to multilateral negotiations, that's a recipe for paralysis. We need to be able to accommodate within the WTO open plurilateral agreements. That's fundamental for the vitality of the WTO. And again, that's a point which I think are very much like-minded with Brazil. We have been making very strongly these points also in the discussions in Geneva. And I think e-commerce is going to be the first test case. Are we able to conclude these negotiations at a sufficiently high level of ambition, with a significant degree of inclusiveness, with the participation, therefore, of a sufficient broad number of countries? And are we going to be able to find a way of integrating this plurilateral agreement within the WTO architecture? So that, for us, is one of the very fundamental challenges that we have in front of us. Of course, e-commerce is not the only one. I mean, there are also important other negotiations taking place plurilaterally in the WTO. I know that Brazil, for instance, is one of the strong proponents of an agreement on investment facilitation, which again would be an important first step to bring investment-related issues more into the WTO. And beyond these issues of e-commerce and investment facilitation, we believe in the European Union that one issue that needs to be tackled is how to ensure a level playing field in relation to the challenges which are associated to state capitalism. And this means, of course, industrial subsidies. This means the role of state-owned enterprises. This means issues like forced technology transfer. All of these are the issues we have been at the core of the conflict between the United States and China. And I have to say that on substance, our views are not very different to those of the United States. We think that there are significant problems about fairness in competition because of the distortive effect of subsidies linked to state-owned enterprises. And this is an issue that needs to be tackled by the trading system. And ideally, we would want to be able to start a process of plurilateral negotiations, which also covered these level playing field issues. Now, we are still not yet there. This is one of the issues that we have started to discuss already with the Trump administration, and we have set up a trilateral process of discussion involving the United States, Japan, and the European Union. We produced some initial ideas about how to strengthen the international rules on subsidies. But we are still basically waiting to see with the new US administration how they wanted to take this issue forward. And by the way, I hope very much that this will be issue that other like-minded countries, including Brazil, would also be interested in working with us. So this, if you want, is the first fundamental challenge. We need to be able to make the WTO relevant, to modernize the rule book, and to use for that purpose open plurilateral agreements as the way to integrate those issues within the framework of the WTO as an international organization. The second, or some could say first, fundamental challenge is to restore a functioning dispute settlement system. I mean, this is absolutely fundamental, and not only for those of us who are very actively engaged in disputes. It provides the basic stability to ensure that when we legislate, we do it with consciousness about the importance of respecting the WTO obligations. And then when there's a difficulty with a country, we have a clear framework to deal with that difficulty on the basis of international rules. So the dispute settlement system is at the core of the WTO. You cannot imagine the WTO without a functioning dispute settlement mechanism. We know, of course, that the United States has been critical for quite some years with the way that dispute settlement had been functioning in the WTO. It is not something which has started with the Trump administration. It was a problem which came from before, although it came to fruition during the Trump administration, which basically stopped the functioning of WTO dispute settlements through its blockage of the appointment of members of the appellate body. Again, we hope that we are going to see a different attitude from the Biden administration. We hope that in the not too distant future, and certainly sufficiently in advance of the WTO ministerial, which is taking place this year in November, there are going to be clear signals from the US administration that they are ready to engage, that they are ready to discuss with other countries what type of changes need to be introduced to the dispute settlement system of the WTO. We are quite ready to that discussion. We certainly consider that a number of the criticisms that have been put forward by the United States are legitimate, and that there are ways in which the dispute settlement system could be made to function better. It is, however, very important that we don't throw the baby with the bathwater. And for us, the baby implies two fundamental principles. One is we need to maintain what is called in WTO terms the negative consensus rule. That is to say, it should not be possible to block the dispute settlement system. Any system in which can be blocked is not functioning. So we need to ensure that we have a system which has the automaticity which the dispute settlement system of the WTO used to have before the blockage of the appellate body. And secondly, we need to maintain, for legitimacy purposes, for efficiency purposes, an independent appellate body. Now, provided that these two elements are respected, no possibility of blockage and an independent appellate body, I think we are quite open to discuss any changes that are justified, that can to effective dispute resolution. And we think it is extremely important that we find a solution on this issue within the next 2 to 3 years. Because if we do not find a solution to this within the next 2 or 3 years, I think it's going to be extremely difficult to restore a functioning dispute settlement system in the WTO. Now, again, we are very like-minded with Brazil on these issues. Brazil has been working with the European Union and other countries to try to maintain what we call a multi-party interim arbitration agreement. Is something that tries to make sure that during this, until such time as we have found a negotiated solution, we keep, at least between us, the system working. But this is not a panacea. We need to be able to have a system that works for everyone. We need to be able to have a system which also works in relationship with the United States. And there's still some very important trading partners are not participating in the multi-party interim arbitration agreement. And we need the legitimacy which is associated with a properly established independent appellate body. So we think that this is going to be absolutely critical, that that's something on which it would be fundamental that over the next 2 to 3 years, we find a way forward to restore a functioning WTO dispute settlement system. And the third challenge has to do with the interaction between the WTO and sustainability. I think, as I said before, if you want to justify the role of an international organization, it's always going to be critical that you can show that this international organization contributes towards the broader sustainable development goals of the international community. And this is an issue which I think implies that we need to see how one can identify concrete ways in which the WTO can contribute towards this broader sustainability agenda. We have two important immediate test cases, which Dr. Negozzi has identified as critical for the credibility of the WTO between now and the ministerial meeting at the end of the year. This is the issue of fisheries subsidies and the issue of trade and health. I mean, I will not enter into the details. I would just say that reaching a conclusion of a multilateral negotiation on fisheries subsidies will be of extreme importance for two reasons. First, because it will be the first time that you actually have a trade agreement negotiated in the WTO whose fundamental objective is to contribute towards sustainable development and to contribute towards one of the sustainable development goals. And secondly, because it will be the first time that we conclude a multilateral agreement in the WTO since the conclusion of the trade facilitation agreement. So it would actually show that even on difficult issues like fisheries subsidies, it is possible to reach an agreement multilaterally. And also, quite frankly, because the most difficult issue that we are facing in these negotiations is one of the fundamental issues that needs to be tackled in the WTO, which is a special and differential treatment. Now, this is going to be an important test case. Can we conclude an agreement on an issue like fisheries subsidies? China, to give you an example, it is the largest fishing nation of the world. It is also the largest subsidizing nation of the world when it comes to fisheries. We would very much expect, for instance, that China would not claim any form of a special and differential treatment under this agreement. But I'm just mentioning this as an example. It's not the only issue that is very difficult when it comes to the discussion on a special and differential treatment. But it's going to be an important test case about how this question can be tackled in the context of the WTO. A second important area where I think the WTO needs to show its relevance is the whole issue of trade and health, how the trading system can respond to the challenges caused by the pandemic. We have been working together with the Ottawa group, putting forward a number of proposals about how to ensure there is appropriate discipline on export restrictions, how to ensure there is proper transparency and that supply chains can be kept open, which is one of the fundamental challenges to ensure a more equitable distribution of vaccines. And indeed therapeutics. I think it would be a mistake just to focus the discussion about vaccines. It is certainly broader than the issue of vaccines. We are now in the European Union about to present a new proposal for discussion in the WTO General Council, where we basically suggest that what is needed is a holistic approach that looks into three fundamental components: disciplines on export restrictions along the lines of what we have been working together with the members of the Ottawa group, and a strong encouragement for companies to enter into voluntary agreements to expand the production. And there can be different types of voluntary agreements. There can be different types of arrangements. For instance, it was quite positive that recently in the Rome summit, Pfizer made some specific announcements about its readiness to supply vaccines at cost or at an affordable price for LMI countries. I think that was an important signal by one of the main vaccine producers. So second element, as I said, we will say what can be done to strongly encourage companies to pledge commitments to enhance production and to ensure equitable supply for those countries which need it. And then we, of course, think it is necessary to discuss issues relating to intellectual property. We don't think that a waiver is a solution, quite frankly, but that doesn't mean that we are not ready to discuss concretely what can be done to facilitate those instruments which are available under the TRIPS agreement to respond to the type of crisis that we are facing. And we will be presenting very specific proposals about what can be done to facilitate the use of compulsory licenses in those cases that countries consider that the voluntary agreements are not working and they feel that it is necessary to make use of the flexibilities linked to a compulsory license. So we will be presenting very specific proposals about how we think that the use of compulsory licenses can be facilitated in the context of a pandemic. And very quickly to other issues. I mean, as I indicated, it would also be important that we see how issues relating to the environment and sustainability can be further considered in the WTO, not necessarily to change the rules, but also to be sure that within the framework of the rules, we can facilitate dialogue, that we can facilitate cooperation. By the way, I would expect that there will also be an interest by the United States and others to see how we can discuss in the context of the WTO issues which are linked to the social dimension of sustainability, including issues relating to labor rights. I know that it's an issue which is politically sensitive, but which I think which cannot be ignored, and that therefore is something that we also need to see how those kind of issues can be discussed within a multilateral framework. And certainly, I would not want to stop without saying a word about agriculture. I mean, of course, it is obvious that an important issue that still needs to be tackled in the WTO is agricultural domestic support. Now, Brazil and the European Union a few years ago presented a joint proposal on how to reform agricultural domestic support. Unfortunately, it was not very successful because there were too many different views in the WTO about how to respond to this issue. We continue to believe that there is a need to reform domestic support in the agriculture sector. At the same time, we think one needs to be realistic. The profound differences of views among WTO members about how to tackle this issue continue to be there. And it is not realistic to expect that between now and the end of the year, this situation is going to change fundamentally. So we think that what is realistic is to identify a work program, something that helps to advance the discussions after this ministerial meeting, hopefully with a view to identify what could be the parameters for an agreement on the issue of domestic support. I would like in any case also to clarify that although I have been setting out, if you want, an ambitious and broad WTO reform agenda that looks into negotiations, that looks into dispute settlement, that looks into the monitoring and deliberating function, we are very conscious that one really needs to go step by step in terms of what can be achieved in what is left between now and C12. We think we should be able to conclude negotiations on fisheries subsidies. It's going to be challenging, but I think it's going to be an important test case. We hope that we will be able to reach a consensus about how the trading system should respond in a holistic manner to the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, including the three elements which I mentioned to you: export restrictions, expansion of production, intellectual property, looking into the three components of that. And then I think we should be able to agree in the ministerial meeting robust work programs that show the way to improve the functioning of the WTO, both as regards negotiations and as regards dispute settlement. We also include a work program to see how to advance on the issue of domestic support in the agriculture sector. And that in parallel to these multilateral undertakings, we continue to work with as many countries as possible on these plurilateral initiatives: e-commerce, investment facilitation, hopefully also on issues relating to industrial subsidies and SOEs, that we continue working on those so that no later than the next WTO ministerial, we can't have concluded agreements. And then that will be the important test case. Can we find a way forward to integrate those plurilateral agreements in the WTO? And I think that will be the fundamental political test case. It's not for this ministerial, I would say it's more for the next one. So I think I will stop there, and sorry if I have been a little bit too long. Thank you.
Thank you, wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Becerro. It was a great honor having you, with us, sharing your expertise and your ideas. It was extremely helpful for our debate. Thank you so much. It was an honor for us. Thank you. So now it's a great pleasure to turn over to Abrão Neto, please.
Thank you. Good morning. I would like to thank CEBRI and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for the invitation, Professors Ana Paula and Lia Valls, Ariane, Mariana. Also my warmest regards to dear friends, Ambassador Marcos Galvão and Ronaldo Veirano. I would like to greet DG Trade Director Ignacio Bercero. Congratulations for your crystal clear presentation and for putting priority on the WTO reform. And also my fellow colleague, Ricardo Mendes. I will try to focus more on the EU bilateral trade deals, of course, from the perspective of an EU trading partner. And afterwards, I will make some remarks connecting this issue to the multilateral discussions. And I guess a good starting point is to ask what is expected from the EU network of trade deals. And there are several objectives that may be related to these agreements. Some are expressly conveyed by the EU, others are more implicit, but I will concentrate on four main goals. First and foremost, the core function of free trade agreements is nothing surprising. It is to liberalize trade, facilitate the exchange of goods and services, and to ensure open access to international markets for EU exports and imports. Here we have the classic role of trade agreements as a tool for creating opportunities and enhancing economic prosperity and integration. In this sense, it is clear that trade deals have been for quite some time now a key pillar of the EU trade policy strategy, definitely in a very active manner in the past years. According to the WTO, the EU is the economic actor, let's put it in this way, with the largest number of regional or bilateral trade agreements in place. The last annual report on the implementation of EU trade agreements indicates that in 2019, the EU applied 44 trade agreements with 76 partners, and also that trade with these partners amounted to more than 1.3 billion euros, representing something like 1/3 of the total of the European Union external trade. So these numbers have certainly grown already, but they are surely big numbers. Then the second function, which is very prominent in EU agreements, is the desire to influence and shape trade with third partners according to European interest standards and regulations. We may notice that in many areas. I will mention just a couple. One that I find very interesting are geographical indications, or GIs. Mercosur, for instance, agreed to recognize and protect more than 350 European products as GIs, which is the largest coverage ever achieved by the EU in a single trade agreement. And of course, some EU competitors don't like that. The US, for example, expressed concern in its last special 301 report on intellectual property. And I quote, the EU GI agenda remains highly concerning because it undermines the scope of trademarks held by US producers, and it imposes barriers on market access for US made goods that rely on the use of common names. So this is an example of a concern. But another area that we see this attempt to shape trade is, for instance, on industrial and agricultural standards, the inclusion of provisions recognizing the importance of regulations adopted by the EU on several industrial products, for example, on motor vehicles, an area where the EU is a leading player, is a very good example. These provisions may cover issues regarding the acceptance of test results and certificates used by the EU. But we can see that in many other areas, animal welfare, and so on and so forth. In the third place, we perceive the EU trade deals being used to strengthen provisions on sustainability and to promote respect for human and labor rights. Ignacio just mentioned what the trade strategy for the EU is on these lines. And in these cases, we're not talking necessarily about the use of trade deals to export EU laws and regulations, but rather to enforce environmental and labor commitments already inscribed in existing multilateral agreements. The EU has a tradition of including sustainable development chapters in its trade agreements for ensuring compliance with ILO standards, with multilateral environmental agreements. Ignacio already mentioned the EU-Mercosur agreement, but for instance, if we look at the recent and apparently frozen Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, or CAI, between the EU and China, we will find that it brings commitments by China to implement the Paris Agreement, and also specific commitments on ratifying ILO conventions on the abolition of forced labor. The EU's new trade policy strategy also indicates the EU intention that all of its future trade and investment agreements include the respect of the Paris Agreement as an essential element, as well as the effective implementation of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And very interesting, the strategy also states that future agreements between the EU with G20 countries should be based on a common ambition to achieve climate neutrality as soon as possible, which ought to be reflected in the NDCs submitted under the Paris Agreement. And well, finally, the EU also assigns trade agreements a role in supporting its geopolitical interests. Again, the new trade policy, we find there a very clear and direct reference to the ability of trade agreements to help the EU to fulfill its geopolitical ambitions in the world. And recently I heard Anabel Gonzalez, now one of the WTO deputy DGs, evoking the first Nobel Prize winner in economics, Jan Tinbergen, to say that one should be cautious in assigning too many objectives to trade policy, if anything, because this makes it more difficult for trade policy to deliver. And I would say that the same argument is valid to trade agreements. In other words, attention should be paid not to overload the role of trade agreements. Well, as today's meeting is also being held by CEBRI's multilateralism program, I guess it is appropriate to mention that EU trade agreements may also produce effects that go beyond its parties and end up influencing the trade policy agenda at a global level, including trade discussions at the WTO. This spillover effect, if I may call it that, is obviously maximized by the wide range of the EU network of trade deals and by the economic and political weight of the European Union in the international chessboard. But as Ignacio was pointing out, some of the very interesting EU proposals to reform the WTO, it occurred to me that both the EU-China Agreement on Investment and the US-China Phase 1 deal bring somehow similar provisions on state-owned enterprises, on transparency of subsidies, and on rules against forced technology transfer that, although being valid only between the parties to these agreements, may point to where debates on updating WTO rules might be going in these areas. That's what Ignacio mentioned as level the playing field on state capitalism. And then just to conclude, I would also like to share a few words on how this new EU trade policy addresses trade agreements. In my view, it's very interesting to notice that the strategy places a greater focus on implementing and enforcing the rights and obligations contained in the existing EU agreements, rather than on negotiating new trade deals. That's the assertiveness part of the trade policy. And of course, this may be explained due to the fact that the EU already has a generous number of trade agreements, but I believe that it also reflects the need to muster support from European stakeholders by showing that trade agreements are effectively delivering what was promised, especially in a moment when we are seeing in many parts of the world an increase in unilateral measures, a growing criticism towards global integration, as well as more inward-looking national policies. Perhaps what we are actually witnessing here is a transition between generations of trade agreements in which the FTAs that prevailed in the last 10 or 15 years are losing appeal and significance, and countries are now looking for a new approach more suited to the challenges of our times. But I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abraão. We hope we have time to discuss a little bit about your provocative remarks. It was great. So in order to save time, I'm going to pass the floor to Ricardo Mendes. Please, Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paula. Well, it's a big pleasure to be here this morning, sharing this panel with some of the most distinguished academics and practitioners in international relations in Brazil. So just wanted to thank CEBRI for the invitation. I want to thank the Konrad Adenauer Foundation as well for this opportunity of being here today. Well, it was very interesting remarks that Mr. Becerra made. And I wanted to organize my comments in three pillars, starting by, I think the most important, I think one of the takeaways, three takeaways, I would say, one of the most interesting takeaways of his remarks is how the European Union remains a bastion in free trade at a time when the world is seeing significant backlashes in trade, in globalization, in just this broader integration. This is a very sharp contrast with the United States, as Mr. Becerra mentioned. It's still unclear which path the new administration will follow, but we do hope that we get some of the most important supporters of free trade and multilateralism back on board and fully supporting this. But the EU has always remained there. The EU has kept a very active negotiation agenda, even at very challenging times for the world and for the European Union itself. I mean, in the middle, they were negotiating Brexit and still kept other negotiations going at full speed. I think this is very important to highlight. And then lending this remarks to our reality in Brazil, it's also important to stress that Brazil has been one of the few countries in the world in the last few years committed to liberalizing its economy, though it's coming from a very different level than the European Union. We still have very high tariffs, we still have a lot of red tape, we still have a lot of barriers to free trade, and tariffs being one of the most visible ones. Just to point out some of the measures that Brazil has been taking. I mean, whenever there has been like unilateral reductions of tariffs. This is really something that very few countries did during the pandemic. Instead of adopting a more protectionist view, Brazil decided to just liberalize and reduce tariffs to zero in several different products. Unilaterally as well, or more internally, Brazil is working on several measures to reduce red tape and facilitate trade in general. However, these are like drops in an ocean. They're drops of small drops in a big ocean. I think Brazil is still continues to be very ambiguous when it comes to free trade. Okay? I think the Brazil itself faces strong opposition in some domestic constituencies, including parts of the private sector. It's not very clear what the position of the industry is. It's not very clear what the position of services is regarding a more aggressive approach to trade liberalization. The commodities industry, of course, they tend to be pro-trade, although they could play perhaps a more active role in ensuring that Brazil engages in these international agreements. We have seen some progress on the trade negotiations front in the last few years, very shy progress. And the most important one being, of course, the conclusion of the negotiations with the European Union. But we don't really see a lot happening. I mean, these are agreements that have been on the agenda for the last 20 years and moving very, very slowly, which is a full contrast, which is a big contrast with what we see in the European Union. Okay? One point that I think it was highlighted here, and we have to kind of bring it to the private sector as well. And it's the climate change, carbon neutrality agenda. This, I think we see Brazil very committed to free trade. We see Brazil, the Brazilian government, willing to engage in free trade. However, we still see the Brazilian society very reluctant of fully engaging or fully changing the approach that Brazil has had in the last several years on these issues. And we have a new issue. I wouldn't say a new issue, but an issue that became of major importance, and it's still not perceived in Brazilian society. When I'm saying Brazilian society here, I'm talking about the business sector. I'm talking about other unions. I'm talking about society in general, which is the climate change, carbon neutrality agenda. I think it's far from clear what the position of Brazil is. And it's not only something that you can blame on the government. Society doesn't discuss these points deeply. And it's going to be very challenging for Brazil to keep its commitment to free trade, to more liberalization, if it doesn't really understand what it wants with this agenda. To get started with, I think one thing is the carbon agenda, carbon neutrality agenda, which shouldn't really be a major problem for Brazil. And the other is the Amazon. When discussions are talking about the environment, when these international negotiations discuss these issues, they all come kind of in a mix approach. And there are different stakeholders with different interests here. So it's something that needs to be really brought to the agenda, to public discussions in Brazil to a level so Brazil can continue or can actually engage in trade negotiations and be fully committed to advancing its liberalization agenda. Well, the second remark I think it's important to make, it's the EU commitment to multilateralism, which was also discussed here. Also, it's a sharp contrast with other traditional advocates for multilateralism, for trade multilateralism. Some of the ideas that the European Union is advocating are very interesting ideas to modernize the organization so the WTO can actually become an umbrella for individual issues that will be built up by members. Okay, so it will continue to be a rule-based multilateral system. However, members will be free to negotiate the agreements that they're more interested in engaging, and this would, of course, increase the importance of the organization, not as a forum for all topics to be agreed by every country, but as a forum that makes the decisions and ensures the rule of law for these agreements that are reached by as many members as that are interested in these topics. In a way, Brazil is also interested. Brazil shares this vision. It has recently formalized a decision to join a plurilateral agreement on government procurement. This is still facing a lot of rejection in the private sector. However, the government has made its commitment to join this agreement. And as Mr. Becerra mentioned, Brazil has been one of the leaders, or has been promoting the agreement for e-commerce at the World Trade Organization, for e-commerce and for trade facilitation as well. And the last point I would like to highlight, which also grabbed my attention in Mr. Becerra's remarks, is the China factor. I think this is a very important factor. It is shaping, it's a new geopolitical reality that we're going to have to deal with for the coming up years. And the EU here seems to be adopting a very pragmatic approach to this. It grabs my attention that at the same time that the European Union is pursuing trade agreements with some of the countries that are directly in the area of influence of China, namely West Africa, the Eastern Africa community, CARICOM, Europe is making sure that it keeps its interests alive in these countries as the Chinese are moving there. And they're at the same time negotiating an agreement with China itself in a very pragmatic way, and just understanding that China is there, they have to be a partner, and it's the way to move forward. I still see this China factor not very clear in Brazil either. I think I'm saying not that the government doesn't understand this. There's a lot of confusion in the government position regarding to this, different agencies with different views, Congress with different views, governors, state governors with different views, but it's not clear in the Brazilian society which path Brazil should follow regarding China. China is the main, of course, trading partner for Brazil. It's also an important source of investments for Brazil, and there's opposition to China in Brazilian society. There's fierce advocates in favor of China, and it's not very clear how the country should position itself regarding this new geopolitical reality. So I'll end here, and I hope we still have time to discuss for an actual discussion. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Yeah, the sign that it is going so well. It's so good, this dialogue, that we are almost out of time. So I have to turn over to Leah, please. Leah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everybody. It was very interesting. We are very short time. We have received some questions from our audience about especially climate change and things like that. But we think it's more important, and it's also for the audience, to have the opportunity to listen again to Mr. Becerra's remarks in response of our Brazilian fellows. What is your perception? Just, I think, 5 minutes, if it's possible. And again, to thank you very much. We have a lot of things to think about, a lot of materials.
Well, thank you very much. And I have to say, I can agree with almost everything that has been said by my two Brazilian colleagues. I think it has been a very like-minded panel, which also reflects the fact that we have a very like-minded position with Brazil when it comes to discussions in the WTO, because I think we fundamentally agree on the diagnosis about what are the problems which are currently being experienced by the multilateral trading system. And I think that we very largely agree also about what are the steps that need to be taken in order to achieve a meaningful reform. I mean, of course, unfortunately, it doesn't depend just on Brazil and the European Union. I think we need a few more partners, including China and the United States, in order to move things forward. Now, I just wanted to make a few comments on climate and are we overburdening the European Union trade policy? Are we just trying to do too many things with our trade agreements? And then perhaps to say a bit more about our whole approach to China, because I think Ricardo also made some very interesting comments on the issue relating to China. Now, I think, in my view, for a trade agreement to work in the European Union, and this is just, I simply think, a political reality, there's always going to have to be two components to it. One component is going to be, is there a satisfactory balance in terms of market access commitments? So do you actually have the economic contours of the agreement in a way that appears to be balanced? And of course, I assume that the same analysis would be done on the Brazilian side. I mean, we are both democracies, so we both need to get our agreements ratified by Parliament. So you need to have this sense that the agreement is balanced in terms of the economic interest. But I think, at least in the European Union, no agreement would be ratified unless you can show that the agreement is consistent with and supportive of at least two fundamental areas of overall policy. One is climate change, and the other one is respect for labor rights. I mean, those two issues have been part and parcel of our trade agreements practically for the last 20-something years. I think for the first time we included a trade and sustainable development chapter in our agreement with Korea. That was the first new generation free trade agreement that was negotiated by the European Union. And ever since, it has been a critical component of our trade agreements. And if anything, the expectations of our political masters have very much increased. I mean, you probably are aware that there's a lot of debate, for instance, now in the European Union about whether we have proper mechanisms to enforce our trade and sustainable development chapters. There has been a debate open in the European Union for some time. We have now undertaken to a review of our policy on this matter, and we would need to come back to the member states and the Parliament with the conclusions of our review. So I think on the one hand, it is clear that you cannot actually put too many things into your trade agreements. But I would tend to think that these two key elements, a clear commitment towards the effective implementation of the Paris Agreement, and that, of course, needs to be seen in the context of the particular agreement that you are negotiating, what effective implementation means, and a clear commitment towards the fundamental ILO conventions. That, I think, is very, very much at the core of our agreements. And whenever we actually go to the moment in which we need to get one agreement ratified in the European Union, these issues always are going to be in the front of the consideration. So I think that, in my view, it would be unrealistic to expect that would be less significant or less important in the European Union trade policy. If anything, I would say the expectation is that we should give it even more importance in the future. And I think Abrao mentioned some of the elements which are included in our trade policy review. These references to the Paris Agreement as an essential element clause. This idea that when we are actually concluding the trade and investment agreements with G20 countries, we would expect those countries also to have a common commitment towards carbon neutrality and to see this respected in the EDC. Those are issues which I can assure you were the result of a lot of discussion, first in the Commission and then with the member states. and reflect the importance that these issues relating to the Paris Agreement, I think, inevitably have in European Union trade policy. I mean, at the same time, there's going to be an important legislative agenda with proposals relating to a border carbon adjustment measure. We have not talked about that, but I can assure that one of the issues that we have been extremely careful is to make sure that when we make the proposal, we design the system in a manner which is clearly WTO compatible, that is not going to impose any burden on importers which is higher than the one that we impose on our own domestic producers. But those issues, I think, are going to be inevitably a very critical component of European Union trade policy, where it is bilaterally, where it is multilaterally, or where it is also in the design of our own autonomous instruments. Now, when it comes to China, yes, we are trying as much as possible to follow a policy which is balanced, which clearly acknowledges that there are important economic interests engaged in our relationship with China, very serious concerns about reciprocity, very serious concerns about lack of effective market access. And that's why an important objective of our negotiations of a bilateral investment agreement with China was to ensure a better level playing field, both when it comes to access to the Chinese investment market, but also some critical elements relating to the level playing field. And as I think Ricardo has mentioned, we include in this agreement a number of elements relating to state-owned enterprises, relating to transparency on subsidies. So this is certainly a very important part of our policy of engagement with China. At the same time, it is very clear that we have serious concerns in relation to China beyond the concerns that we have on the economic side. There are concerns about issues relating to labor rights. There are concerns about issues relating to human rights. And we certainly think it should be perfectly possible for the European Union to take action to respond to those concerns. And I will be very frank, the very strong reaction from the Chinese side on these matters at this point in time has put a big question mark on the ratification of our agreement on investment. I don't think you can really expect the Parliament to ratify an agreement with some members of the European Parliament are being subject to sanctions by China. So I think that we are trying to follow a policy which is balanced, which is certainly looking into economic engagement, but at the same time not hesitating to take into autonomous action, either because of concerns relating to labor rights or human rights, or because of concerns relating to lack of a level playing field. And that's why, for instance, one of the areas in which we are now developing new legislative instruments in the European Union is on the area of subsidies, to make sure that we have effective instruments to respond. In the case of subsidies, we have a distortive impact on the market. We think, however, that there's a need to engage with China also in the WTO. I mean, you cannot really imagine the global trading system without China. I mean, China is the largest trading nation in the world, so any reform of the WTO needs to also integrate the perspectives of China. And I think that we would agree with the point that has been made that if there's a willingness from the Chinese side to engage, the issues that would need to be negotiated are relatively easy to identify. I mean, the issue of forced technology transfer, I think it is true. It is reflected in the bilateral agreement between China and the United States, and is also reflected on the CAI. There are also elements relating to state-owned enterprises in our agreement with China. Not by the means everything that is needed, but at least there are elements related on state-owned enterprises. The fundamental issue that is not there in any of our bilateral agreements, because it's an issue that inevitably you can only negotiate when you have a critical mass of countries, are issues relating to effective disciplines on industrial subsidies. That's the issue which is not really tackled, neither in the phase one agreement with the United States, nor in the CAI. And that's the issue that we had started to do joint work with the United States and Japan during the previous administration. And we hope that we would be able to present in the not too distant future further ideas to discuss with others about how to try to also update these rules on the industrial subsidies. Again, not multilaterally, because we don't think it's realistic to imagine that can be negotiated multilaterally, but among a critical mass of countries on a plurilateral basis, which I think we very much agree. This type of plurilateral agreements is the way forward for the WTO to show that it is relevant when it comes to modernizing the rules. So I think I will stop there.
Okay. Thank you very, very much. Unfortunately, we are completely short of time. We can't continue to talk about this. There are a lot of very interesting points. For us, it was very important, the contribution of Mr. Bracero, the contribution of our colleagues, Abraham and Ricardo. Thank you very, very much. And unfortunately, we cannot have any more comments, but CEBRI will produce a short report on this, and will be very, very interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna, for your partnership that I hope we can repeat it. Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you again. Okay?
Thank you,
everybody.
Lia.
Have
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bracero. Thank you.
Obrigado.
Obrigado.
Okay, obrigado.